everyone. In this video, we're going to describe some of the functions related to digestion that occur in the oral cavity and in the esophagus. So we'll start by just sort of drawing a person and checking out the relationship between many of the structures, including the structures of the digestive tract as well as the neural structures that will control some of the events that will happen. So the oral cavity is made up of teeth, and there are actually 4 different kinds of teeth. There are incisors, which are the blade-shaped teeth at the front of the mouth, and their functions are clipping and cutting food. And then there are the cuspids, which are the cone-shaped teeth. Those are like the vampire teeth. And their function is tearing and slashing, which I always think about is, like if a vampire is tearing open skin to suck the blood. And then we have bicuspids, which are also called premolars, and they are kind of flattened crowns. There's 2 that are sort of behind or next to each of the cuspids. And then we have molars, and there could be up to 3, and they're also flattened crowns. So the bicuspids and the molars are responsible for crushing, mashing, and grinding food. And of course, if you have your wisdom teeth out, then you might only have 2 sets of molars in the back there. We can also consider the tongue. The functions of the tongue include mechanical processing of the food, moving it around the mouth so that it's easy for the teeth to chomp on it. Also, the tongue has many taste buds for sensory analysis of the food. And finally, we have the salivary glands. There are 3 types of salivary glands, the sublingual, submandibular, and parotid salivary glands. And the sublingual and submandibular are both sort of in the lower jaw, kind of below the tongue. And then the parotid gland is more in the cheek. And these glands secrete saliva, and the functions of saliva are kind of vast, but include moistening the food for swallowing, dissolving the food particles so that they can be tasted by the taste buds. It's also responsible for clearance of acid from the esophagus. It also contains some digestive enzymes, and they would be salivary amylase and lingual lipase. And so the thing to know about these enzymes is that we can actually start digestion of carbohydrates and lipids with the amylase and the lipase, amylase for carbohydrates and lipase for lipids, but there's no chemical digestion of any proteins in the mouth. Once the food is finished in the oral cavity, it will be transferred to the pharynx and then the esophagus. So we remember that the pharynx is a shared structure between the respiratory system and the digestive system. And then the esophagus is something we haven't really discussed previously, except to say that it's posterior to the trachea. So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of the esophagus. The esophagus is about 10 inches in length and about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. It's guarded by an upper esophageal sphincter at the top and a lower esophageal sphincter at the bottom. So the upper esophageal sphincter can be abbreviated UES, the lower LES. And the lower esophageal sphincter is actually also called the cardiac sphincter. So if you read that somewhere, know that it's really the same thing. There's not an additional sphincter. The esophagus is a muscular structure, and it's actually comprised of varying amounts of skeletal and smooth muscle. So the upper third of the esophagus is skeletal muscle exclusively. The middle third is a combination of skeletal and smooth, and the lower third is only smooth muscle. The esophagus is lined with an epithelium that is meant to resist abrasion, hot and cold temperature, and chemical attack. So we think about all the things that we eat, and every time that you burn your tongue on something and then think that its next stop is the pharynx and the esophagus, and the esophagus has to kind of hold it together for quite a long time. So the cell structures are intended to sort of meet that challenge. At the very bottom of the esophagus, we actually will connect to the stomach, and the stomach is part of the abdominal cavity, the peritoneal cavity, whereas the esophagus is located in the thoracic cavity. So in order to have sort of a continuous tube, we actually need to pass through the diaphragm, the structure that separates the thoracic and peritoneal cavities. So the hole in the diaphragm that allows the esophagus to pass through is called the esophageal hiatus. And what's interesting actually is if you have an enlargement of that hole, some things from the peritoneal cavity can actually squeeze up into the thoracic cavity, and that would be considered a hiatal hernia. The other thing we want to mention in terms of pathophysiology is that if you have a weakened lower esophageal sphincter, we can actually experience heartburn or acid reflux. So that sphincter is supposed to be nice and tightly contracted so that anything from the stomach doesn't move upward into the esophagus. But when we do have acid that moves up, it can cause burning pain, and it can be very uncomfortable. So now that we've described both the oral cavity and the esophagus, we want to talk about what actually happens with the food as we make that transfer to the pharynx and to the esophagus to travel down to the stomach. So that would be the process of swallowing. Of course, the scientific way of describing that is deglutition. And there are 3 phases of swallowing. So first we have the oral phase, and this includes the tongue compacting the food into a bolus, so just kind of like a tight ball of food, and it compresses that bolus against the hard palate. Now, this is what will cause the transition to the pharyngeal phase. They're actually sensory receptors, and if that food bolus kind of travels back just a little bit from the hard palate to the pharynx, the sensory receptors in the pharynx will recognize that there's food that's ready to be swallowed, and it will trigger the swallowing reflex. And the swallowing reflex is actually controlled in the medulla and the lower pons. And so, of course, what we'll have is sensory receptors that travel to the medulla, and then it will trigger sort of a quick turnaround of motor output from the medulla, where will actually cause the contraction of the pharyngeal muscles, and the food will pass through the upper esophageal sphincter. Once it passes through the upper esophageal sphincter, we are entering the esophageal phase, and we transfer the bolus of food to the stomach via a process called peristalsis. So peristalsis is a really important concept. It's one of 2 methods that are used for sort of muscle contraction to move food along or around in the GI tract. So peristalsis is basically rhythmic contractions of adjacent sections of the smooth muscle cells, and its purpose is to propel the food or the bolus in a forward direction. So it actually is sort of like a ring of contraction all at the same time, so that, it's kind of like if you imagine like squeezing toothpaste like in the tube, you want to kind of move all of it at the same time, not kind of squeeze half of it so that the other half moves back on the other side of the tube. So my favorite example for truly thinking and understanding peristalsis is, this reminds me of like cartoons. Not that I watched any cartoons when I was a kid, I really didn't, but it kind of reminds me of the cartoon where you have a snake and then you have a mouse, and the mouse is eaten by the snake. And so initially we see the snake is nice and kind of flat. His body's really skinny, and the big part is his head. And he takes in that mouse, and then, like in the cartoon, they show a big lump in his snake body where the mouse has been ingested. And over the passage of time, as he digests the mouse, we actually see the mouse kind of move down the snake body. And so you could kind of think of it as if he's got little muscles inside, he's essentially squeezing kind of at the tail end of that mouse and pushing the mouse forward. And then like the next section will squeeze and push the mouse forward, and the next section will squeeze and push the mouse forward. And the same thing is happening inside the esophagus. A little less cool than the snake example, but needless to say, very, very important that it works properly. So we move that food along, and then when it reaches the lower esophageal sphincter, it will force the sphincter open just because of an increase in pressure in the area, and it will actually cause the food to move through. So the esophageal contractions are also under neural control. So we have increase in stretch in the esophagus, and that will communicate with the brainstem, mostly by the vagus nerve. There is a little bit of crossover. We have some somatic neurons that travel from the esophagus and can sense, and it actually, it's interesting because the pathway for travel of neurons is closely linked to and actually merges with neurons that come from the heart. So that's why it's kind of easy to confuse sometimes like esophageal pain or reflux with chest pain. But anyway, so we travel the sensory information to essentially to the medulla, and we have vagus nerve output, and the vagus nerve will cause the contraction of the esophageal muscles and propel that food bolus forward. So that actually concludes our explanation of the events of the oral cavity and the esophagus, and in our next video, we'll talk all about what happens in the stomach. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.